Hi everyone, I am Rebecca from ChemKnits and I'm ready to dye my first yarn of 2021, and I am excited to combine some of my very favorite things, both Wilton's Violet Food Coloring and Black Acid Dye, to create a fun layered resist colorway that I think is going to be really fantastic. Now, before I explain more about the project, I want to give a huge shout out and thank you to my lab partner today, Cosmic Geologist. Thank you so much for being my lab partner, and I really hope you're going to love the yarn that I dye. Now, Wilton's Violet Icing Color contains artificial food coloring. It has red number 3 and blue number 1. And these food coloring colors will split apart when we dip dye to create some really beautiful broken colorways with pinks, purples, and blues. Especially when we use a non-superwash yarn. Today I am going to dye 200 grams of Knit Picks Wool of the Andes worsted weight yarn. This yarn is 100% Peruvian Highland wool. It's non-superwash and it's one of the first fiber types I ever dyed. Now, to dye yarn with food coloring, you do want to make sure you pick the correct yarn. This technique works really well on wool, alpaca, silk, other protein-based animal fibers, but unfortunately you cannot dye plant fibers like cotton, linen, and flax, or synthetics like acrylic and polyester with food coloring. So pick the right yarn. The other things that you will need will be the artificial food coloring, some acid, in which we'll use vinegar, and heat. And if you combine all those together, you can create some beautiful yarn. Occasionally people ask me about the softness of Wool of the Andes. I personally use this as my workhorse yarn. I make all of my family's winter hats out of this. I even have cowls that I love, things that get a lot of heavy use, and it holds up so well. So I do actually really recommend it. It's not as soft as, say, a merino, but I don't find it scratchy and I find it comfortable to wear. So I personally recommend it and really recommend it as a great heavy use yarn. I haven't noticed any pilling or anything like that. If you'd like to learn more about the yarn or tools and equipment that I'm using today, I do have affiliate links down in the video description. Now, one other note before we get started. The first step of our dyeing project today is going to be with food coloring. I am personally comfortable dyeing yarn in my kitchen with cooking pots and pans when I'm using all food safe ingredients like food coloring and vinegar and things like that. For the second stage of dyeing, I will be using a commercial acid dye. And so at that point, I will transition from kitchen equipment to dedicated dye equipment. So I just wanted to point that out and make sure that's really clear. When you're using commercial dyes, make sure you're using equipment that is dedicated for dyeing yarn and is not also used for food. So since I'm doing these two stages, I'm doing this and some other food coloring based projects first, and then I'm going to transition my kitchen and workspace to using commercial dyes later this afternoon, in case anyone's curious about how I'm having it set up. But right now, everything I'm using is just only used for the preparation of food and other kitchen activities. That's a long introduction, so let's go get into dyeing our yarn. In my pot right now, I have about 10 cups of water and no acid. I do want to pre-soak the yarn a bit before we start dyeing, and today I'm just going to pre-soak it in the pot. This means I'm not going to start heating things up. This water is just at room temperature, but I am pressing it down, and I'm going to let it soak for probably 15 to 30 minutes or so. I'm not worried about it being completely saturated since we are going to add resists and things later. And in general, dyes absorb slower to a non-superwash yarn than they do with superwash. So you have a little bit more time, and it's a little bit more forgiving if you want to get really even color coverage. Normally I pre-soak yarn somewhere else, but today I figured why not do it in the pot. We may end up adding more water volume before we start going and breaking the violet. We may end up adding more volume before we go and start dip dyeing into the Wilton's Violet, but for now, at least we're gonna get nice and pre-soaked. Let's prepare the dyes. This icing color is thicker and more of a gel than, say, Wilton Colorite, which is liquid. So it can be a little more challenging to mix and dissolve. Therefore, I always like to start with warm tap water. So in this cup, I have half a cup of warm tap water. Now, I think that these are all at varying degrees of, okay, that's nearly empty. I do have some full ones if I need it. All right, in general, I like to start, oh yeah, these all might be nearly empty. In general, I like to start with around half a teaspoon of icing color per 100 grams of yarn, but today we're gonna do a little bit less, so the color's a little less saturated, and all of these are nearly empty. So I will need to go get a new bottle, but right here I've got about a 1/4 teaspoon. I'm gonna go ahead and dissolve this in water. And I'm also providing a really good example of why you should wear gloves if you don't wanna stain your hands. But you can see even with stirring for a little bit, a lot of the gel color is still on our spoon. And so this is why the warm water just makes it easier to dissolve it in the water so that way you can get more even color on your yarn. And don't worry, I am gonna save these containers and we'll use them up at some point. All right, I've got a new container. So we've got about half, and then I'm gonna do about, so it'll be about 3/4 of a teaspoon. I was planning on doing a heaping half teaspoon, so this is a mega heaping one, but it won't be too much color and will still be pretty, and you can see just how fast it is dissolving because we've got the warm water. So now I'm gonna set this aside until our yarn is pre-soaked. I mentioned that Wilton Violet breaks. What does that mean? Violet is a purple color, and as we mentioned, it's mixed up of red and blue. Red number 3 binds to yarn really, really fast and doesn't require as much acid or heat as blue number 1. And so as we dip dye the yarn, the reds will start binding to the yarn really, really fast, and the blues won't, which means that by the time we add all of the yarn into the pot, the reds have already exhausted, leaving the blue behind. And this will give us a gradient of color with a deep pinkish purple, maybe even getting pinker than this, going all the way to a bright blue. And yes, I do have this mug on Zazzle, but this is a photograph of a gradient I did with this colorway. Now, red 3 is a little bit finicky in that if you add it to the dye pot with acid too soon, some of the red will start to crash out of solution and you'll see a bit of a pink film at the top of the pot and around the edge. So I like to add the dye to the dye pot as close to when I'm about to add the yarn as possible. So I hope that this tip helps you when you are playing with food coloring going forward. Now, another question that I figure is worth answering is why dye yarn with food coloring at all? I think that food coloring is a really great way for people who want to play with dyeing yarn as a hobby to get started. It is really fun. You can make really bright colors, and if you take care of them properly, they can last a really, really long time. And by taking care of them properly, I mean always wash in cool water and keep them out of direct sunlight as much as possible. And as I said, I'm comfortable using my cooking pots and pans to dye yarn with food coloring in my kitchen, and I let my kids do that with me. So whereas when I transitioned to using more commercial dyes, I bought a whole set of tools and equipment and spoons. I do have a blog post talking about my favorite tools and equipment that I use for dyeing yarn that I always have linked in my video descriptions. And so I share this because rather than investing in things and then deciding you don't love the craft, food coloring, the techniques, food coloring is technically a type of acid dye in the way that it binds to yarn. So it's a great way to play with color, figure out if you enjoy the hobby of dyeing yarn before diving in to getting set up for commercial dyes, which give you a wider range of colors that you can play with. So I hope this helps. But now I think we can go get set up our dye pot. I'm now going to remove the yarn from the dye pot, and you can see that if I just lift it up, there's a lot of, not a lot of liquid left. And so I'm going to squeeze out some of this liquid. We will be dip dyeing the yarn later on, and I'm okay with some unevenness of color. I am going to go ahead and add, I think, 2 more cups of water to our pan. And now I just turned on the heat, and we're going to heat things up. Now we still need acid, and so I'm going to add the acid in the form of white vinegar, which is acetic acid, and I am going to add 1 tablespoon of white vinegar in what is probably around 10 cups of water. This is not very acidic, but this should allow those red threes to start striking to our yarn, and the blues actually won't be able to start striking yet. Now, my tap water does run slightly acidic, so you might need to make adjustments from my proportions if you are trying to replicate this at home. So keep that in mind. But oftentimes, especially with superwash yarn, I will see red 3 start to strike before I even add any acid, additional acid to my yarn. All right, we are hot. I am going to reduce the heat to low. I've got the yarn ready to go over my hand. And now I am going to add our food coloring, stir it up, and then immediately we're gonna start dip dyeing. Now, sometimes I get questions, and I'm gonna dip fairly slow. Sometimes I get questions about adding non-superwash yarn to a dye bath, and wouldn't that cause felting? In general, I think that the bigger risk comes from adding hot wool back to cold water versus the other way around. So you can see as I add the yarn in, see that little bit of blue at the tip, but then as I come back up, the blue sort of wicks back down because it's not binding yet. But I do want to separate the skeins a little bit, and I have my food tongs here to assist. We're already seeing some breaking. Basically, what we're waiting for as we dip slowly is for the water to become blue, and when we lift the yarn up, we want to see very, very little pink. That is when we're going to know that we can sort of get this bright blue that we see to stick around. And it doesn't take that long. And sometimes if you go a little too fast, then you might end up without like a lot of the bright blue at the end. You might end up with more of a purple, and that is fine. But those reds, shoot, as I splash, those reds do start striking pretty quickly. In general, you don't want to splash. Well, let's see. Yeah, I think we're pretty good. I'm going to go ahead and add the rest of the yarn, and you can see those color differences with the pink to the more blue to this bright blue at the end. And here at the end, there could still be some reds in there. I didn't entirely check, but we've got a beautiful broken color here. So what I'm going to do now is add some more acid. I just added 2 tablespoons of white vinegar, and I'm going to add a third. In general, at my house, I find a proportion of 2 tablespoons of white vinegar to 8 cups of water is sufficient for colors to bind to wool yarn. So we've got more than that in here, which should help this color bind. But now I'm going to let this sit for 15 minutes, and then we'll come back. It's been about 15 minutes, and I wanted to show the little bubbling before I reduce the heat to just show that a little bit, ideally you want to stay below a simmer, but a little bit won't necessarily felt things. And if we check the color, most of that color is in the yarn. If I checked at this point and we still saw a lot of bright blue liquid, then I would say that we would, oh yeah, looking at that, it's definitely cleared a lot. If we still saw a lot of bright blue, I would say we would want to add more acid. And you can see we did have some red left. We've got bright blue, but also more of a purplish blue at the end, which is totally fine. I've just moved it in the pot, and I'm now going to turn off the heat completely and leave the yarn in here to cool. This is going to serve 2 purposes. One, it means that by cooling slowly, that's better for the fibers, less felting risk, but also there's a hint of color left. So we can see like the, I mean, not really, but there might be a hint of color left, and so this will give the yarn more time with heat to let those colors absorb and set. So once this has cooled completely, or at least is cooled so I can comfortably put my hand in and remove it, then we will add some resists and talk about our next dyeing stage. But cosmic geologist, I was feeling cosmic here. So I hope you're gonna like it. It's been a couple of hours and actually we are completely cool now. So I am gently removing the yarn. Gonna squeeze out this liquid and set it aside. And then we're gonna reuse this dye bath to leave no dye behind. I heated the pot back up until it got to about a simmer. And then I rinsed out the cup where we had mixed the original Wilton's Violet, added it to the pot, and then dip dyed a skein of Knit Picks Hawthorne fingering weight yarn into the pot. This yarn is 80% superwash fine Highland wool, 20% polyamide. It's 2-ply high twist, but I thought that it would be fun to just get a more pastel broken violet colorway using up these leftovers. Since there is a lot of acid in the pot already, things are gonna strike a little faster. It's not a true comparison to the broken violet we did before, but it's still just a beautiful colorway and a way to leave no dye behind. Okay, I filmed the voiceover before I actually started dip dyeing here, and it absolutely looked like there was more pigment in that cup than what we have here, which is just a light blush of color. I mean, this is quite pastel, but either way, I'm gonna leave it in the pot for probably I'll leave the heat on for about 15 minutes, then let it cool slowly, and we'll probably wash it off camera. Let's section off this yarn. And the way we're gonna do this is come in to the yarn and take a zip tie and just pull really tight. And I am going to attempt to treat the two skeins really, really similarly. Now, I'm just looking to separate it, the two sides. Okay. Gonna connect them together here and here. And then we're gonna do the same thing over here. Sometimes when I place resists, I do it incredibly randomly. And then other times I try to be a little more even. Now in each of these resist points, we are limiting the access of the next dye to the fiber. So inside these resists, we will have, okay, coming back to just one skein. Inside the resist, there's area where the dye can access on the outside and places where it'll access more on the inside. And I'm coming over and I'm actually adding 3 zip ties next to each other, which there's little areas right here. I'll zoom in a minute, but there's little areas where the dye will be able to access the outside of the fiber, but it's gonna make a larger section for that pink. And honestly, I'm not sure what my rationale is for connecting the two skeins together, other than it's fun. Because in all cases, we are adding these restraints around the same amount of yarn. But I actually do want to go get some more zip ties. Haha. I reuse these zip ties over and over and over again. Eventually, they do at some point stop working as well on the color, but overall I've been very, very happy with how they have held up. I suppose the one thing that sort of bridging the two skeins together does is it makes, I don't know, it's just fun. It's a little harder to get it tight on just a single width though, but maybe we'll try. The more resists we add, and this works, it's just going to be a little harder to undo. The more resists we add, the more of the bright color we will preserve. Now, if you really wanted the resists to be teeny tiny, like specks of stars, the best way to go about doing that would be to not go through the whole skein at once, to go through a couple strands at a time. But that it does take longer. I do have some examples of videos about that on my channel. But the perk of the zip ties is, as you can see, it's really easy to go on. They are really, really easy to take off at the end. And so it just makes it nice and fun. So here on the end, I am adding 5 because I can. And I tried to do an okay job at maintaining as many different hues from our broken violet as possible. You could do the resist dyeing on black first and then go through and dip dye into broken violet, but that might shift the way things come out just a little bit. So I am really excited. And just to zoom in on one of these areas, you can see that there's some yarn exposed. In here, there's going to be points where the dye won't be able to penetrate because of the tension here with the resists, but it will still be really, really fun. This is my 4-inch deep full-size K9 steam pan, and I am going to come in with the yarn and spread it out. And let's see. I think that skeins there. I don't know if I have a different skein on top in each of the two sections or not, but I have it spread here in the pan, and I think I want to add 8 cups of water. It looks a little bit like a chromosome right now. Let's not forget that this is non-superwash yarn, which means that it will absorb colors a little bit slower than our superwash counterparts. There was some acid in the yarn, but I'm going to go ahead and add 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 tablespoons of white vinegar to our 8 cups of water. The water is, I would say, probably about room temperature. Some of the yarn is above the surface because there's a limit of how much I can spread it out. But now let's go take it to the stove and start heating things up. And while we do that, we can prepare the dye. In this bottle, I have a 1% stock solution of Dharma True Black. This is my favorite black acid dye because it does not break when speckling. And I am going to take about half a cup of this stock solution. And a 1% stock solution means that there's 1 gram of dye dissolved in 100 milliliters of water. So a half cup is about 118 milliliters, or approximately 1.2 grams of dye. Now this dye stock was mixed about 5 months ago, so therefore take everything with a grain of salt because things may have crashed out, and so everything is approximate. For the most accurate, consistent results with your stock solutions, I recommend either heating to make sure things are redissolved, or really mix them fresh as close to when you want to use it. But I'm not going to fill this up with water, so we have about 1 liter of the dye mixed. Okay, we are getting steamy. There may have been a tiny bit of soap left in my beaker because, well, we got some suds, which is not standard. So I really only have it in about 800 milliliters, but the total volume is not that important. Now what I'm doing is slowly pouring the dye over the yarn. And I'm not moving the yarn right now. So there is some resist inherently in here with how I am adding the dye, how it's able to spread, and things like that. But what diluting the dye did, and I'm going to hold this in reserve, what diluting the dye did is it allowed me to add a greater volume, which allowed me to spread it out a bit further. Now, if this were a superwash yarn, then the way that I added the dye would make a huge amount of difference in the way that the colors are absorbed. And since this is non-superwash and now I'm coming in poking a little bit, it's not going to make as big an impact, but it's still going to make an impact because we've got some yarn out of the water, some in. So I think what I want to do is let this heat for about 10 minutes. And then maybe we'll try to flip this over as best we can, given all the zip ties, and pour more dye in. And so what this is letting us do by layering the color, even though we now have more consistent color over on the sides, it's allowing us to introduce some more tonal variation within the whole skeins than if we were to have completely submerged it in a pot. We still might have had some more tonal variation, but it's just different. So anyway, I'll see you in about 10 minutes. I am going to reduce the heat here, and we do not have to, we don't have to use all of the dye. I am attempting to flip this over, and things are very steamy, so I cannot see everything. But what I do see from flipping this is actually more of the dye has cleared than I had expected, which is always a good thing to see that it's clearing. Okay, coming in with the rest of this dye. Sort of coming all over, not the most even, but we don't want super even coverage. So that is pretty good. I've done a really good job for me for not poking. Now, there are going to absolutely be differences between the two skeins, but since we have the resist points at very similar places, we should get things that are a bit more similar. So this time what I'm going to do is I am going to let this sit for 2 minutes. I'm debating with myself. I'm going to let this sit for 5 minutes, and then I'm going to come and add more water so more of the yarn can be submerged. Okay, it's been 5 minutes, and I'm now going to add 8 cups of water, which now has things a bit more submerged. And I'm also going to come in with 1 liter of water. This is residual from where we mixed the dye to begin with. And if I come and move things now, a lot of the color is in our yarn, but this is going to add some gray all over. And I am going to just, it's going to need to heat back up. I might need to add more acid at some point, but I'm going to leave this, I think, for 20 minutes, and then we'll come back. After about 20 minutes, you can see that it is clearing because you can see down in the pan, but there is still a lot of color in here. And I might need to add more vinegar. I'm not sure, but I'm just going to quickly move things a little bit, and then I'm going to leave this on the low heat for another 20 minutes. Okay, the yarn has cooled, and you can't really see, but I see some really, really deep saturated purples and blues in here. So now what I'm going to do is, ooh, the resists. I'm going to remove gently some of the liquid, and we are going to go and remove these zip ties. I don't know what's going on with that. Huh. There's like a mark at the bottom of the pan, but I will try to get that off, and if I can't, I will certainly come and talk about it. So even before the yarn is dry, I can just tell that this is going to be beautiful. Here we have our more pink end and our more blue end, and it is just so deep and saturated. Let's separate the two skeins. And so I'm coming in down here to open this up and see the brightness that we have. And yes, it is smaller in some areas and larger in others, just because of the way that the yarn is positioned. But I am so excited, so excited for how this is gonna look. Okay, let me zoom in for the next one. Okay, here we go. Sometimes with the zip ties this tight, it helps to push a little bit before trying to remove it. You can see on the outermost edge, we do have more of a sharp line, but then more towards the interior, you can see where there was a little bit more resist just on how that was positioned. And here we go. These zip ties last really well over time. Eventually, they do stop having as good of a hold. But now, we should be able to separate this completely. There almost feels to be an element of green in here that there wasn't before. And that really excites me. Because there's no yellow in the violet, but well, the black I think is a pure pigment, so I don't know. Ooh, this is cool. Check out this patterning here from the way those zip ties were positioned. There was a little bit of access of color, and that almost gives some little black specks, which is just really fun. And it's hard to get something that sharp on a non-superwash yarn. So if you wanted to get just the speckle the width of the zip tie, again, you would probably want to do, well, it would be hard with zip ties, but you'd want to do small regions all over. Now that we don't really see that gradient from the dip dye, it's pretty amazing that this blue, bright blue, and more purple color all came from one mixture. And that's why I just love color breaking. And pushing these out. All of these zip ties are going to be dark now. I really like that black mark on the pan. I just tried to scrub it off and that didn't really work. I really hope I don't discover a burn mark on this yarn because it is stunning. Okay, now down to the other side. I love that under the black we can still feel a bit of the blue and the more pink colors. That is exciting. I could have gone with more black dye and then it could have been true black everywhere, but I wanted to hold on to some of the cosmic beauty that we have here. All right. The contrast here is not as big as it was in the others, but it is still gorgeous. Oh, I cannot wait to see this dry. Now finally we have the end where we had 5 zip ties, and I can say for certain that this is easier to remove than when I did string. And over here, I think that maybe it wasn't tight enough. Or else this was more saturated. We'll see when we open this up. Oh no, I'm seeing some contrast. But yeah, so it might have just been that much darker. And so on camera, I'm actually seeing a little more contrast than what I feel in person. But, oh, this is so cool. All right, I just have to remove this last one. Yeah, the times that I've done string, the results are also really great, but it just can take a really long time to add the string and then a long time to remove. So I like the zip ties, especially if this is something that you want to do more of. It is still time to scale up, but not as much time as if I was going to be tying string. And since I can reuse the zip ties, there's not waste. Oh, check it out. I really wanted to still have something that felt repeating, and these feel fairly matched. Not identical. They're definitely not identical, but we'll see when they're dry just how similar they feel, and I am really excited. So now everything is cool, so let's go wash it. Now comes our beautiful resist yarn, and you do want to wash acid dyes on cool, but check out those pops of color. There's still soapy water in my sink, but I am adding some soap here to the rinse bath, and I'm not expecting to see any bleeding, but sometimes with blacks, sometimes with blacks there can just be a little bit that rinses out. I'm not super concerned. I wish it wouldn't happen. Wow, that is more than I was expecting. Oh, there could have been some pigment trapped around the zip ties maybe. Oh, that is already looking way better. Let's see. I don't want to rub the yarn because I don't want to felt it, but I am washing, and yeah, that's already looking so much better. So much better. So I'm going to do soap one more time. One of these days I'm going to have to start using Synthopol. Apparently it can help sort of bring any excess unbound dye into solution, so then you can rinse clear faster, maybe? Oh, but that's looking good. I'm not seeing any problems. All right, I'm feeling way, way better. And oh my gosh, these colors are so good. Things are gonna be lighter when they're dry, but there is no question. Unlike the times when I tried glazing Wilton's Violet with navy and then was unclear or unsure if the colors were really coming through, these colors are coming. This black should show up. But anyway, I am now gonna go put this through my spin dryer and hang it to dry. The black marks did scrub off of the pan with a sponge, not just with a paper towel, but a little sponge and elbow greased it. I will check the yarn thoroughly once it's dry because I'm not sure if it was just some dye at the bottom that somehow left that mark or if the yarn actually scorched. I haven't ever scorched yarn, but it's bound to happen to me someday, so I'm gonna check the yarn thoroughly. It didn't smell scorched, thankfully, so let's keep our fingers crossed. Man, I love layering colors. I suppose that this guy needs to be shifted a little more like that, but this is beautiful. Now, obviously there are differences. We see sharper marks there, it's less sharp over here, but if I flip it, these are honestly pretty well matched. Again, not identical. So cosmic geologists, when you knit with them, I recommend alternating skeins if you don't want there to be a potentially visible transition between them. But given that each skein is not a perfect repeating pattern, that there's some potential asymmetry within the skeins, it might not be that big of a deal. And they are pretty darn similar. Now, this whole type of resist overlay is absolutely gorgeous. But you could do this over other types of dip dyed colorways. It doesn't have to be broken violet. And there aren't a lot of dyes that will break as extremely as violet food coloring does. But you could dip dye your yarn into two different colors and have an overlap in the middle and use that to play with your initial color or space dye or do all kinds of techniques for the underlayer. And I think that I've played with many different versions of the first dye for this type of resist in the past. You can barely see our Leave No Dye Behind skein up there. It almost blends in with the contrast of our bright layered violet yarn. But there was a tiny bit of violet color left in the cups, and honestly I thought there was more than there was, because we have this beautiful pastel skein that is mostly pink. The blues you almost don't feel. So I don't know exactly what was going on, but it's pretty and I really like it. Cosmic Geologist, thank you so much for being my lab partner today. I hope that you have had as much fun as I did creating this galaxy yarn. I am Rebecca from ChemKnits, and if you enjoy my videos, please subscribe. What are you waiting for? Give this video a thumbs up and leave me a comment below to let me know what you thought. What colors would you like to play with for this technique? If you've been a ChemKnits fan for a while and want to support us on another level, go and check out the ChemKnits Patreon. Patreon's a really great platform for people to go and support the content creators they enjoy, and I have some fun perks. You can read more about it over there. There will be a link to Patreon and other places you can find me on the internet down in the video description. Thank you so much for watching.